Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic, famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere, nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
Life is made up of many gorgeous moments. Cherish them all, big and small, with Blue Nile. Whether it's for yourself or a loved one, Blue Nile's unrivaled selection of expertly crafted fine jewelry and statement pieces help make all your moments sparkle. Blue Nile's experts are on hand to guide you, and their diamond guarantee ensures you get the highest quality at the best price. Celebrate a life well lived in the most radiant way and save up to 30% at BlueNile.com. That's BlueNile.com.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. I'm very pleased to announce that pretty much sat next to me is Quentin Tarantino, who's agreed to answer whatever question I put to him.
And I'm shutting your butt down.
Thanks, Quentin.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
In movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, there's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, well, it's given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, development stories, marketing stories, release stories, unmade movie stories this week. Basically, all the ingredients that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast even lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation that somehow films usually get made. Now, ordinarily, as regular listeners will know, I do two films in each particular episode, separated by some cunning attempts to sell some of the stuff that I do. This episode's slightly different because in the days leading up to me recording this, the ongoing quest to finding out what Quentin Tarantino's 10th and final movie is going to be has taken a further turn or two. So, what I'm going to do is, for the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode, I'm pretty much not going to talk about a film that's actually happened. We're going to look into the unmade 10th Quentin Tarantino film. I obviously can't set that up with a movie trailer as usual, but I will set it up with a bit of this interview that Tarantino gave while he was on the promotional trail for The Hateful Eight, talking to Jimmy Kimmel on his chat show. The rest of the story will follow the other side of this.
Well, the movie is very, very entertaining. Another classic. Quentin, one more thing for you. And of course, I could talk to each one of you individually for 3 hours about this stuff. You said you're only going to make 10 movies in your career. This is number 8. Are you really only going to make 2 more movies after this one?
Well, that's the idea. That's the idea. I mean, one of the things about it, though, where I'm coming from, I actually think a lot of directors, I don't think it's that much of a tragedy. It'll probably take me 8 years to do that, all right? So we'll see how everyone feels 8 years from now. But I think a lot of directors, they talk about, oh, I want to do this thing and that thing and this thing and that thing, but I have time to do this and time to do that. And I actually think they have far less time than they think they do. And so I'm not going to think that I have 4 movies or 6 movies that I will eventually get around to doing them all. If I only think that I only have 2 movies, well, that keeps it at the tip of the spear, if you know what I mean. That means that those ones better be good, and I better mean everything about them.
It was then, all the way back in 2019, that Quentin Tarantino released the film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which at the time of recording is his most recent movie. A box office hit. It also attracted Oscar interest. Brad Pitt won his first Academy Award for his work in the movie. And, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood tantalisingly set up the finale for a filmmaking directorial career that, most of us had known for some time was coming to an end, because Quentin Tarantino had been very open about the fact he was going to retire. So the first hint that he was looking to, prematurely really, bring the curtain down on his film directing work came in 2012 as Django Unchained was making its way into the world. Now, at that time, Tarantino gave an interview to Playboy magazine and he said, I quote, "You stop when you stop. But in a fanciful world, 10 movies in my filmography would be nice." He argued, he said, "I've made 7 at the point of Django." He says, "If I stop at 10, that would be okay as an artistic statement." And his reasoning there was, quote, "I just don't want to be an old man filmmaker. Directors don't get better as they get older. Usually the worst films in their filmography are the last 4 at the end." And he said, "I'm all about my filmography. I'm all about basically how one bad film could, well, clock up 3 good ones." I mean, other directors have said similar things before. Alan Parker just said, the late Alan Parker said that as directors get older, they just basically make the same film over and over. He put time on his directorial career with Angela's Ashes. More recently, though, we've got people like Martin Scorsese still making really interesting movies into their 80s. So I don't think it fully holds water, but also you can sort of see where Tarantino was coming from. So if we count Kill Bill then as one film, as Tarantino does, even though it was released in 2 parts, this meant at the point he'd made Django Unchained, Tarantino had 3 films left to go. Now, the next one was going to be The Hateful Eight. That in itself was a bit of a production saga that Tarantino was going to make that film. Then the script leaked online. Then Tarantino wasn't going to make that film. Then he staged a live script reading of the film, of the script of the film that he wasn't going to make. And then the film that he wasn't going to make became the film that he ultimately did make, and that was film number 8. So then what was film number 9 going to be? Because around the time he was promoting The Hateful Eight, he reiterated he was retiring from directing and, he was considering doing work in film criticism. In fact, in more recent times, he signed a 2-book deal and wrote a novelisation of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. He's written a book called Cinema Speculation as well. He's podcasting too. Who would do something like that? But in 2019, he released the film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And at that point, all eyes were really on Tarantino to see what will you do next. And here we are 5 years on from the release of that film. And the answer to the question remains, I don't quite know. Because, for a while, it was all about the speculation. Tarantino would take a little bit of time anyway, generally between projects, to work out what he was going to do next. The surprise candidate that came out, just sprung up very quickly and out of nowhere, was a Star Trek movie. Now, it's little secret that Paramount Pictures was struggling where to go next with big screen Star Trek movies. 2016's film Star Trek Beyond, it had gone down okay, middling 3-star reviews, decent box office, hadn't set the world alight. And so Paramount had a decision as to whether to make a 4th film with the crew of Star Trek Beyond in it, or it could reboot, or it could go off in any number of directions. Few of us saw the idea of an R-rated Quentin Tarantino Star Trek movie coming, but that's what we were teased with for a while, because it was at the end of 2017, even before he'd finished Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that Tarantino pitched the idea for a Star Trek film to Paramount Pictures. And perhaps understandably, Paramount Pictures absolutely bit his hand off. Yeah, that would put a lightning bolt through the franchise. Didn't go down massively well with Star Trek fans, or at least a subset of Star Trek fans, but still, Paramount wasted little time getting its checkbook out and hiring a room of writers to flesh out the idea of what this could look like. Tarantino brought these writers in, and Drew Pearce, Lindsay Beer, Mark L. Smith, Megan Amran, they were tasked with just trying to work out what this was. Now, J.J. Abrams, he of Bad Robot, whose company has basically overseen big screen Star Trek in recent times, he was involved as well. Tarantino and Abrams had chatted about it. Tarantino also had noodled with the idea of doing a franchise film before. It's no secret he liked the idea of doing a James Bond film, but a very raw, back to basics James Bond film, a la Casino Royale, actually, as it turned out. But Tarantino obviously didn't make that. But when it came to Star Trek, Mark L. Smith, who'd penned The Revenant, eventually took the lead on the project while Tarantino went off to make Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And Smith put together a script that would have put Captain James T. Kirk at the front and centre of everything. Would have been an R-rated Star Trek adventure. Tarantino confirmed that himself. That also caused a bit of a furore amongst Star Trek fanbase. Star Trek, wherever you stand on it, is not an R-rated franchise for good reasons. And so this was a bit of a grenade into the midst of all of that. However, by the end of 2019, in the midst of his Oscar run for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Tarantino had second thoughts. Talking to Consequence of Sound, he concluded that Star Trek for a final film wasn't right. I mean, if it had been his 6th or 7th film, maybe a franchise movie, that would have been okay. But as your big finale, well, it was probably too big, if anything. There were also going to be too many cooks on something like that. And he's told Consequence of Sound, he said, look, I might come up with a really big idea, but right now the idea of a smaller audience almost all the way around is appealing to me. And so the idea of a lower budget film that just didn't have such high expectations on it, that was kind of where his head was moving towards. Paramount, meanwhile, continued to develop Star Trek. It brought in around the time Tarantino was making this announcement, Noah Hawley to work on a Trek film. That didn't happen. In fact, it's only at the point just weeks before this podcast is recorded that it's been announced Paramount is now working on a Star Trek Origins film set for tentative release in 2025 with Toby Haynes directing that. That will be a fresh new cast coming in as well. And I mean, Tarantino in early 2020, he still hinted his Star Trek film might happen, but it's not going to happen. Nobody thinks it's going to happen. It's one of those projects that might turn up in comic book form or something, but a cinema screen, just not going to happen. So that was candidate 1, really, for film number 10, and that wasn't going to be the film. So what was? I mean, there was speculation, and Tarantino fueled it a little bit, although I think a couple of these were just statements that he'd made, and the press kind of ran with them a little bit more than they should, because in 2021, he expressed interest in doing a fresh take on David Morrell's novel, First Blood. Now, this was the novel that introduced John Rambo, and Sylvester Stallone starred in the first film adaptation of First Blood, which is brilliant and very different from the Rambo sequels that followed. But the tone of Rambo on the big screen had moved very, very far away from what David Morrell had put in his book. And so Tarantino liked the idea of going back to that, possibly with Kurt Russell as Rambo this time round. He also suggested he liked an old script that David Webb Peoples of Unforgiven and Blade Runner had written of the comic book Sergeant Rock. But if he wasn't going to do Star Trek, a few of us really thought he was going to do a comic book movie instead. And so as much as Tarantino loves his comic book films, more the comic books really, the idea of him doing Sergeant Rock as a final film, well, that wasn't very likely either. So the questions kept coming. I mean, Tarantino was promoting his books, and so inevitably, what's your 10th film going to be? And by the end of 2021, I mean, we were now moving on to the idea of a comedy, a spaghetti western comedy of all things. And I mean, an avid fan of spaghetti westerns, you can see Sergio Leone influences on Tarantino's work. I mean, he'd hired composer Ennio Morricone to do the score for The Hateful Eight, of course. And Collider reported that Tarantino was saying at the end of 2021 that I'm looking forward to shooting that comedy because it's going to be really fun. He said, I want to shoot it in the spaghetti western style where everybody's speaking a different language. The Mexican bandito is an Italian, the hero's an American, the bad sheriff's a German, the Mexican saloon girl is Israeli, and everybody's speaking a different language. And you just know, okay, when he's finished talking, then I can talk. That kind of film. But was he really serious about it? Again, it's kind of hard to tell. Tarantino loves talking about movies. And, he talked for a while about how Kill Bill 3 was an option for his 10th film. And he'd enjoyed talking about that over time as well. And, I mean, there was a point in the 2010s we were going to get Kill Bill 3, 10 years on from the first films. That would have been an interesting way to catch up with Uma Thurman's The Bride character. And then as we all got older, 20 years on, that could be Kill Bill 3. But in the end, Tarantino said in interviews that they're exhausting films to make, these big action movies, really. Did he want that to be his final film? No, it turned out he didn't. And so by 2021, he was veering away from that as well. It was in March of 2023, though, that the Hollywood trades reported that Tarantino had made his mind up. We knew what film 10 was going to be. It was going to be a film called The Movie Critic. Now, this was going to be a 1970s set movie about someone who, well, basically wrote film reviews. Very, very simplistic. None of us have read the script. It hasn't leaked at this point or anything. The original speculation was that the late legendary film critic Pauline Kael was going to be the template for the title character, but that was put to bed really within a week or two of the news landing. Instead, the lead was going to be male, and Tarantino would confirm in May 2023 that it was going to be a film about a male film critic who wrote for an adult magazine instead, based on a real person who Tarantino was not keen to name. The idea was, by the spring of 2023, The Movie Critic was going to go into pre-production in June of that year, and it was going to be set in California in 1977. Paul Walter Hauser was linked with the title role as well, and had things gone to plan, that's exactly what would have happened. The film would have shot. We might even have been watching a trailer for it by now. Heck, we might even have been teased with the release of it. However, Hollywood in 2023 was the year of strikes, and one of the casualties of the strikes was The Movie Critic, that the Writers Guild and also the Screen Actors Guild both took industrial action as they negotiated fresh deals with studios and streamers. Studios and streamers were not in a rush to settle this, that the strikes went on for months, probably months longer really than they needed to, but with both sides playing hardball and studios not particularly keen to hand over money or to hand over any land really. It just went on and on and on and on, and that's had ramifications for this. I mean, this has been recorded in April 2024, and it's had major ramifications really for the blockbuster movies we're seeing, or more to the point, not seeing in 2024. That we're getting the Wolverine Deadpool crossover film in the summer of this year. That just about made it through the system. All the Marvel films, they've been delayed. Mission Impossible 8, that's been delayed. Some films made it through. I mean, the wonderful horror Abigail had to shut down filming for several months. The cast had to come back together to complete the movie, which, if you've seen Abigail, that's quite testing to get back into that mindset. That's managed to make it into cinemas. But The Movie Critic just found itself in limbo. Tarantino reportedly continuing to develop it, continuing to write the script. And so it wasn't until the strikes lifted and we got to the end of 2023 that The Movie Critic was looking like Quentin Tarantino's 10th film after all. The expectation was that the film was on its way forward, and by the very end of 2023, the murmurings were that The Movie Critic would be going before the cameras in 2024. And indeed, by early 2024, The Movie Critic did appear to be moving. The Hollywood trades were reporting such, and the idea was, I mean, it'd been delayed, but the idea was do a single day of shooting in California in 2024, just one day, because then the film would qualify for a tax credit and you could reassemble everyone and shoot the rest of the film in early 2025. This would allow Tarantino just about time to get the film ready to debut at the Cannes Film Festival in 2025. Tarantino's relationship with the Cannes Film Festival is pretty legendary, and it would be a very, very logical and understandable that he'd want to debut his final film there. Just look at how he got Inglourious Basterds into a releasable state, even though it wasn't ultimately the complete final version, just in time to get it to the Cannes Film Festival. That's how important it was to him. And so the idea then, shoot the rest in 2025. Sony, which had backed Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that was circling The Movie Critic. And in February 2024, along came more casting news. Brad Pitt, he was interested in taking a role in the film. Then a real bombshell, Tom Cruise was linked with the movie. That Tom Cruise, in February 2024, did a deal with Warner Brothers to develop projects there. And there's just been a sense that once Mission Impossible 8 is done, Tom Cruise's franchise work at Paramount Pictures, which is where he's been for pretty much the last decade, would be coming to an end, and he would be looking for other more dramatic and risky affair alongside his blockbuster roles. So in February 2024, we were potentially looking at The Movie Critic with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise in the movie. That's proper star power. And then, I mean, let's move forward to April 2024. Again, the month this is being recorded. And I mean, just days before I've sat in front of a microphone, the bombshell news hit that Quentin Tarantino had walked away from the film. This is even though also, outlets like Production Weekly were listing that the shoot had been booked, that the movie was going to be filming in California. It was going to be up and running in front of the cameras. But the suggestion was that Tarantino had actually walked away from the Movie Critic several weeks before, that even though websites, including my own, were reporting that the shoot was imminent, Tarantino had moved on even before those words were being tapped and appearing magically on screens. And instead, he was going to look for something else for film number 10, because the stories began to emerge in the days afterwards. And Tarantino's been silent on this. I'm sure at some point he will come out and put his full side of this. But there was stories that, as he continued to work on the Movie Critic, he'd brought in the character of Cliff Booth from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, of course played by Brad Pitt. Now, it would fit into the timeline of when the Movie Critic was set, and also it's a Hollywood story. So again, the crossover was relatively logical. But as he continued to develop, it became almost a separate film in its own right. And it was the Hollywood Reporter that's just added that the Movie Critic had been in flux for some time, that Quentin Tarantino had changed the focus of his screenplay to making it a more direct spin-off from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It would no longer effectively be the Movie Critic. It would be a Once Upon a Time in Hollywood prequel, stroke sequel, something like that. He wanted to do something again with the character of Cliff Booth. Brad Pitt clearly enthusiastic to do so as well. And so it wasn't going to be a crossover. It was an entirely different film. But was that going to shoot in 2024? I mean, that had been moving forward as well. But even as reports of the Movie Critic being lined up for production were being written, Tarantino had moved on from that and was on the verge too of abandoning his idea for a Once Upon a Time in Hollywood follow-on, stroke prequel, stroke sequel, something of that ilk. And in the end, he pulled the plug on both of those films. Now, this is 5 years on, nearly we are now, from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and 12 years on from the first hints that Quentin Tarantino was going to retire after 10 films. And it kind of leaves us almost back at the drawing board, because reports now are that Tarantino is going to look for something completely from scratch, develop something, just completely from page one, which in turn is clearly going to take a fair amount of time to do. Now, in the past, he's resurrected projects that have been on his docket for a while. Inglourious Bastards, he came back to after nearly a decade of first mentioning. The Hateful Eight, he came back to after saying he was abandoning that film. Will he go back to the Movie Critic? Will he go back to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in whatever form he was planning to do that spin-off movie? That's pretty much unclear. But also there's a feeling now that he's almost made a rod for his own back, that because he was so overt with the fact that he was looking to step away from directing a film, and because he was open and told people that 10 films and it was going to be just pretty much where he stopped his film directing career, at least, well, now there was a weight of expectation on whatever that film was going to be. Now, was it that expectation that led to him stepping away from the Movie Critic? Did it have to fit a template of what a big final movie would be? Again, only Tarantino really knows the answer to that. But I think it was, as the Hollywood Reporter speculated, if Tarantino hadn't mentioned he was going to retire, had made his final movie and then stepped away, announced his retirement once that film was out in cinemas, would that have changed the choices that Tarantino was looking to make? As it is, it's hard to shake the feeling, and he's a much better filmmaker than me, so, no judgment. It's just hard to shake the feeling from the outside looking in that Quentin Tarantino has almost boxed himself into a corner by being so open about his plans. And at the point we're sat here recording, even if he put together a script in the next couple of months, managed to get it shooting the start of next year, we're now looking towards, I would imagine, the earliest we could see a new Quentin Tarantino film is the end of 2025, early 2026. But even then, there's an increasing amount of self-brought pressure on his shoulders. And so if I were a betting man, thank goodness I'm not a betting man, well, I'm not sure where I'd put my money on when that film would be. Could he just leave his career at 9? Could he just kind of do some kind of rewrite and say that Kill Bill's actually 2 films? Don't know. I think we're at the point now where it's hard to rule that much out. The only thing that seems relatively certain is the Movie Critic ain't going to be filming anytime soon.
BTW, FYI. Visit Nexplanon.com RN to learn about Nexplanon. It's an adjustable implant, 68 milligrams radiopaque. Or ask your HCP IRL. Okay, TTYL.
And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. I'm going to do my parish notices while I've got your attention. Please don't switch off. First of all, if you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it, and first of all, thank you so much for listening to it, then there are 3 ways really you can do so that really help me out. The first, if you're feeling particularly generous, if you head to patreon.com/SimonBrew and put some coins in the pot there, then you get the podcast early. You get it ad-free. You get it early pretty much every week. You also find the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes at Film Stories as well. And the money that you put in just helps keep the Film Stories project going. So huge thanks to everybody who supports me on Patreon. It's much appreciated. Costing you absolutely nothing is to head to your podcast home of choice and subscribe. And likewise, if you wouldn't mind leaving a hugely positive review while you're there too. Those are little things that help independent podcasts such as this one. Thank you so much to the hundreds of people who've left such lovely reviews. I appreciate it enormously. I do see them. I try not to mention them because, you don't want me to turn into big-headed and all horrible and stuff like that. I also do print magazines, and the latest issues of Film Stories and Film Junior magazines are up for sale at the moment. We're up to issue 49 of Film Stories. It is the UK's biggest film magazine. It's 168 pages. This one's nearly selling out as well. We are championing 14 British independent movies on our front cover. It is the riskiest front cover I have ever done. I'm in the midst of doing issue 50 as well, which feels absolutely bizarre to me. That's gone up for pre-order too. You can find that at store.filmstories.co.uk. That's also where you can find the latest issue of Film Junior magazine, where I've had young reporters talk to the likes of Jack Black and Awkwafina for the latest issue of that. Thank you to everybody who supports that too. But that's enough parish notices, isn't it? I will have news of more live events soon, by the way, but I'm going to move on to a film story. That seems like a good idea. Let's go all the way back to 2000 for this one, and I'm going to set it up with a clip from the trailer. We'll come to the story of this particular film, the other side of this.
You have no actual training.
I have kids. Learned a lot right there. Yeah, and I'm great with people. When I was first out of high school, I got married and had a kid too young. I'm extremely fast learner. You got a really nice office.
Look.
You want my number?
I do.
How about this for number 6? That's how old my daughter is. 8 is the age of my son. 2 is how many times I've been divorced. 16 is the number of dollars I have in my bank account.
I'm so glad we got that out of the way, because I didn't find you attractive either.
Then we're even. I'm smart, I'm hardworking, and I'll do anything, and I'm not leaving here without a job. Don't make me beg.
In a law firm, you may want to rethink your wardrobe a little.
Well, as long as I have one ass instead of 2, I'll wear what I like, if that's all right with you. You might want to rethink those ties. Why are there medical records and blood samples in real estate files? Would you mind if I investigate this a little further?
What makes you think you can just walk in there and find what we need?
They're called boobs, Ed. Can I just...
And that is a clip from the 2000 film Erin Brockovich, screenplay by Susanna Grant, directed by Steven Soderbergh, and starring Julia Roberts, Albert Finney, and Aaron Eckhart. So the story of Erin Brockovich, well, it's a true life story, as you more than likely know, of a single mother of 3 who took on a company in California that she believed was polluting the local water, and in turn that led to local residents becoming ill. This company, PG&E, well, the people who were becoming ill were often fatally so as well. And so Brockovich's story was she campaigned legally for justice with some success and compensation for the people affected. A woman with no experience, no training, and railing against corporate America really at its very worst. And so this was taking place in the early to mid 1990s. And as a story, it felt ripe for a movie as well. Yet the catalyst to getting Erin Brockovich to the big screen turned out to be, of all things, a chiropractor. I've been doing this podcast since, 2018 now, nearly 6 years. It is the first chiropractor I have mentioned on it. And the chiropractor was, amongst their patients was Carla Santos Schamberg, an executive producer who was involved in Danny DeVito's production company, Jersey Films, married also to Michael Schamberg, who was one of the partners in Jersey Films. And as she recalled, I couldn't believe it when my doctor told me about her friend Erin, who also happened to be a patient of the same chiropractor. And so the said chiropractor told the story and eventually got the two of them together. And as Carla Schamberg said, it seemed incredible that this twice divorced woman with 3 young children who had no money, no resources and no formal education had single-handedly put this case together. And again, as Carla Santos Schamberg said, I thought she seemed like the perfect role model for the new millennium. So she got talking to Michael Schamberg, and the pair were discussing the idea of the project as well. This whole idea of bringing Brockovich's story to the screen, and also alongside that, the lawyer Ed Masry, who was persuaded to help her with her case. And in fact, the real Erin Brockovich told The Independent in an interview that she and Ed Masry had talked about the idea of a film. And she said he'd always asked me, if they really do make this movie, who should play you? And Brockovich said, I was always uncomfortable with the question. I'd say, I don't know, I hope it's someone funny like Goldie Hawn. And Ed would say, I was thinking someone more like Roseanne Barr. And I was like, what does I say? Cluck you, Ed. And he'd laugh. And he said, all kidding aside, I don't care who it is, as long as it's not Julia Roberts. There you go. Now, with the option taken on Erin Brockovich's story, on the writing side, Susanna Grant reflected to Backstage how she would come to the film. Now, she'd been mentored by the late Nora Ephron, whose screenplay to When Harry Met Sally is still pretty much perfection, isn't it? Ephron had given her a piece of key advice as well, which is don't write what they want. They don't know what they want something good. Just write something good. And so Susanna Grant's screenwriting breakthrough was at Disney, at Walt Disney Animation Studios, where she was hired to be one of the writers on the 1995 movie Pocahontas. Now, Pocahontas was expected to be a huge film for Disney. All of its A talent was on it. The B talent, if you like, was put onto The Lion King, where expectations were lower. And so the pressure on Pocahontas was really quite intense. And it's a really interesting piece that Susanna Grant wrote over at Medium on working on Pocahontas, about how low down the food chain really that she was, and what a really testing time really, that everything had to be rewritten by, often off the back of notes of people who hadn't read what had been written beforehand, and it was more a case that time ran out on the project than the script was ever finished. But it was invaluable experience that led to her next job, a more successful project really, the film Ever After, starring Drew Barrymore. Then she came across, she got into conversation with an unknown producer, and I think it was, reading between the lines, I wouldn't be surprised if it was Carla Santos Schamberg, and they were friends. And the producer told her about the story that she'd optioned, the Erin Brockovich story, and Susanna Grant was really, really interested. The problem was there was already a screenwriter who had been offered the job. That would be Callie Curry, who'd penned Thelma and Louise, and so was very much the first choice for the script. She'd been approached, and as Grant again told on a post on Medium, a few weeks went, Callie Curry passed on the job, and so she got back in touch, and now an offer went out to Paul Attanasio. And she said it went on like this. I'd call, she'd mention an A-list writer, we went back and forth. And then finally, by the sounds of it, quite a lot of writers had passed on this. And as Grant said, I think she just got tired of hearing from me and said she'd introduce me to Erin. Now, this was going to be the crucial meeting, because if Erin Brockovich approved, then Susanna Grant had the job of at least taking a stab at the draft of the film. And as Grant said, a lot of things about the experience of Erin Brockovich, the movie, were great. But I think researching the script was probably the best part. And that in part was the working with Erin Brockovich too, because Erin Brockovich did like Susanna Grant. She did get the job. And so Grant then threw herself into research, and she talked about just how much they laughed, how fun it was. She said getting to know Erin and Ed, meeting the plaintiffs from Hinckley in California, where the story took place, where the real life story took place, and seeing the amazing end result of Erin Brockovich's dogged determination and her just plain human decency was nothing short of a privilege, and it was fun. Now, the backdrop of the story isn't fun. Of course, that the case against PG&E was suggesting that its actions led to death. I mean, there's no way around that, really, that Susanna Grant was balancing this incredibly bubbly and incredibly fun central character against a very, very difficult court case that was going to go on in the background. And so, it was a challenge. And it was a challenge she said she struggled with at first when it came to writing the script. And it was only when she ultimately reconciled that the Erin Brockovich she was going to put on screen was not going to be the Erin Brockovich in real life. I mean, there would be a lot of crossover, of course, but it reads like she almost had to treat them as two different characters. And the one on screen she could be in charge of, that she could make that Erin do what she needed to do to make a film script work. And that's how she managed to crack it. And she penned the screenplay and took a few liberties with it as well. And she said, let me tell you, if you think turning a script into a studio is nerve-wracking, try turning it in to the person on whom the person is based. And so she did that. She put together a script, incidentally, that just had one courtroom scene. That even though this is the backdrop of the film is a legal case and a legal process, she wanted it to be about the investigation. She didn't want it to be a courtroom drama, and so that was important. And that's how she. That was another of the key decisions she made with the script. She had to wait for Erin Brockovich to call and leave her thoughts on the script. The first thing that Brockovich noted was, there's no easy way to get through this. I shall delicately get through it as best I can. Susanna Grant had written that Erin Brockovich did not wear underwear, and Brockovich said she did wear underwear. There you go. We got through that together. Well done, us. But other than that, she was receptive to the script. That the key thing for Erin Brockovich, the real Erin Brockovich, was to get word out about this company, Pacific Gas and Electric. That was it. That was the real objective. That's why she wanted it on the big screen. She was open to the idea of bits of her character not being entirely authentically represented, but getting the word out about PG&E, that was hugely important to her. Now, with the script in place and coming together, then there was who's going to make it and who's going to star in it? And so Stacey Sher, one of the other partners at Jersey Films, had worked with Steven Soderbergh on the film Out of Sight. Out of Sight is a really important film in Steven Soderbergh's back catalogue, that in the 1990s, he was seen as the indie darling off the back of his debut feature Sex, Lies and Videotape. What he proved with Out of Sight was he could bring something to a studio movie as well, that even though the movie didn't make huge amounts of money at the box office, very, very highly regarded, and he'd made that within the studio system without punch-ups, without fights, without things going wrong. And so, Stacey Sher looked at that and just thought, well, he might be the right person for this. Soderbergh, a very, very busy filmmaker. He was looking at making the film The Limey with Terence Stamp at this point. With The Limey, incidentally, he would go back to operating his own cameras as well. He loved the idea of just looking through the viewfinder of the camera himself, not relying on Video Village, and really being absolutely in the throes of a film set. And so Steven Soderbergh saw it almost as a Rocky story, that he said the screenplay was very linear. He said it was performance driven and had a female protagonist who was in every scene in the film. I'd never done a film like that before, and it really appealed to me. And he'd add as well that Erin's story was very compelling. I hadn't known anything about the case, but Jersey Films had been trying to get me to read the script for a year. Then, as is invariably the case, as I was finishing The Limey, I was looking for something completely different to do. It's the old directorial cliche that the film you make is a reaction generally to the one you've just done before, and most people choose to go in a very different direction. Now, in April 1988, the script had also been under the nose of Julia Roberts. This was when it was first reported in the Hollywood trades that she was potentially interested in this. Now, she had a busy docket at that point. She was making the film Notting Hill with Hugh Grant. Then she was reuniting with Richard Gere to make The Runaway Bride. But she was interested in the role. And, I mean, things would move on a little bit. It wouldn't be for several more months, really, before it seemed to get a bit more serious there. And also her asking price to star in the movie, well, she wasn't pricing this as an indie drama. This was being made by movie studios. She wanted $20 million to star in the film. That was the asking price of the top male movie stars in the 1990s. $20 million up front. It's what people like Jim Carrey had managed to negotiate. For instance, Mel Gibson had managed to negotiate that kind of money. But a Hollywood studio had never paid $20 million to a female lead in a movie. It took Julia Roberts' agent pointing out that there was a bit of a double standard at work here, when the studio initially was reluctant to pay Julia Roberts quite that much cash. Here she was, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, female movie star on the planet. And as it turned out, in 1999, she would have two gigantic hits with Notting Hill and The Runaway Bride. And so it was only after significant pushback that the studio agreed to write the check, making Julia Roberts the first female lead to take home $20 million up front for a single film. The budget for the overall movie was going to be in the $55 million mark, so Roberts taking $20 million of that. She'd actually also been a little reluctant about making Erin Brockovich at first, because she was going to come straight off the back of Runaway Bride, off making two films back to back. Did she really want to throw herself straight into making a third? But she knew that Steven Soderbergh was potentially interested. She really liked the script as well, and she wanted to work with Steven Soderbergh too. So she signed on the dotted line, and Steven Soderbergh would be on the dotted line not long after that as well. It just needed, amongst the supporting cast to get a really good name to take on the role of Ed Masry. Now, legendary actor Albert Finney was certainly on the radar for the film. He hadn't done, towards the end of the 1990s, he wasn't doing too many films. He turned up in Breakfast of Champions and Simpatico in 1999. He was doing bits of television, of course, hugely acclaimed for his stage work as well. He got multiple Oscar nominations under his belt. But when it came to offering him the Erin Brockovich script, he initially turned the role down. Now, Finney was famously a man at this stage in his career without an agent, and as Entertainment Weekly reported, the original shooting schedule would have required Albert Finney to be in Los Angeles for far longer than he actually wanted to be in Los Angeles. He's based in the UK. And so it was Danny DeVito, actually, in the end, who happened to know Albert Finney's girlfriend. Now, she was said to be a travel agent as well. And so DeVito, basically, instead of trying to persuade Albert Finney, would try and persuade his other half. And they tried to make the decision a bit easier for Finney as well, just by agreeing to put his scenes close together in the shooting schedule, so he wouldn't have to be in Los Angeles for anywhere near as long. Now, Finney, in the production notes of the script, obviously puts a slightly jollier shine on it all. He said, "I was immediately interested when I read the script." He said, "It was so gripping that I read it in one sitting." Then what happened was Steven Soderbergh flew to London, had lunch with Albert Finney. The two of them hit it off, really got on. And as Finney said, "I responded very well to him and thought I'd enjoy working with him. He seemed relaxed and easy and admiring of some of the work I'd done in film in the past, which immediately makes one warm to a person." This was all coming together. And on the studio side of things, there was a deal struck between two studios to split the financing of the movie. That was Universal and Sony, who had done, they'd enjoyed success doing something similar on Philip Noyce's movie, The Bone Collector. Philip Noyce was a guest on this podcast a few episodes back. But what happened with that is they split the cost and the profit down the middle, and they basically agreed to, one studio agreed to distribute the film in America. The other studio would take on distribution elsewhere in the world, and so they hatched a similar agreement with Erin Brockovich to split the costs. And thus, on May the 5th, 1999, with the budget in place, with The Runaway Bride in the can as well, Notting Hill just on the verge of release, Julia Roberts and the rest of the cast and crew were on set for the start of shooting of Erin Brockovich. Now, the movie would spend part of its time shooting in the Hinckley area in California, where the real-life events happened. As Soderbergh said, I push for using the actual locations unless there's a compelling reason not to. And so they spent around a month in the California desert shooting where the contamination had happened. And he said, when I first came to Hinckley, I was struck by how a big company could overpower a small town, how easy it would be for residents to be forgotten. And he says, you know that you're shooting things that you can't buy, that you could only get by going to the exact place. The strive for authenticity also meant that both Ed Masry and Erin Brockovich, the real ones rather than the film ones, had already been consulting on the film. The script, in fact, had been fact-checked with them, and they were available throughout the production as well, should things need clarifying or things need checking or whatever. Soderbergh chose to shoot the film, almost in a documentary style, really. For lots of the time, he kept two cameras rolling at once as well, because what he was looking for was a degree of spontaneity from his actors, that he was willing to give them just a little bit of rope, just to stray from the script as well. And he was hoping just to capture little moments that just weren't written down on the page. Now, as much as Brockovich herself was on the script as well, in fact, she takes a very small role in the film, Steven Soderbergh was keen that Julia Roberts and Erin Brockovich were kept slightly separate, that what he didn't want was his lead star imitating the woman that she was playing with the film. There is, though, that moment in the movie where they meet on screen as Erin Brockovich plays a waitress called Julia in the film. Roberts' wardrobe was, towards the risque side. I think we can say that. The costume designer's given one or two interviews about this. I think Julia Roberts described an Erin Brockovich dress as a DRE, because it's a dress without the SS bit, because it was, let's just say, slightly on the short side. But she was embodying the character, she was embodying the role as well. She really wanted to capture, really, who this woman actually was. Soderbergh would shoot a lot of footage. There's an awful lot that was excised from the film. I'll come to that just in a second. But for instance, there was a sequence shot in a hospital when Erin Brockovich was checked out in hospital as well. But this was a relatively brisk shoot that filming would wrap up after 3 months in August of 1999. All the while that the film was going on, incidentally, Steven Soderbergh was also preparing the next movie he was shortly about to shoot. That would be Traffic, which I've covered before on a previous episode of this podcast. But it's interesting that, in the last episode, I was talking about Steven Spielberg making Saving Private Ryan on a run of 3 movies that he did: The Lost World, Jurassic Park, he did Amistad, he did Saving Private Ryan, and didn't leave more than 6 weeks between the shoots of those 3 films. In the case of Soderbergh, he went from The Limey to Erin Brockovich to Traffic, and then while he was making Traffic, he was preparing Ocean's 11, where he would have a reunion with Julia Roberts. But still, to get back to this particular story, there was the small matter of editing Erin Brockovich and turning it into the final cut of the movie that we ultimately saw. Now, that was a bit of a challenge. Soderbergh talks about this in the director's commentary on the Erin Brockovich DVD, about how the first cut of the film came in at 3 hours and 15 minutes long. And so it took a reasonable amount of excising. It's why you get a lot of deleted scenes on the DVD. Remember when people used to do things like that? But he managed to get the cut down with the help of editor Anne V. Coates to a slimmer 130 minutes, which was the version of the movie that would make it into the world in March of 2000. Now, before that, there was still the matter of just showing it to a couple of people. That there was a screening put on for Ed Masry and Erin Brockovich themselves, the real life ones, and the pair of them found themselves keeping tabs on how often Pacific Gas and electricity was actually mentioned. Going back to the interview that Brockovich did with The Independent, she said it was either 64 or 65 mentions, and every time we heard it, Ed and I would high-five each other. All I was thinking was, that's going to burn them. That was really where Ed and I were coming from, because the truth was really going to be exposed. Test audiences were keen on the picture with a reservation or two. As the New York Times reported in the summer of 2000, it ran a really interesting article on test screenings about how films such as Roland Emmerich's The Patriot was scoring really, really highly. Erin Brockovich was testing well as well, although executives at Universal, as per the New York Times, were concerned that audiences would not forgive the character's filthy language, let's say that. Susanna Grant, meanwhile, in her Medium article, also noted that there was one particular card from one test audience member where the person concerned wrote that the first 99 times I saw her breasts were enough. The film then went before critics ahead of its release in March of 2000, and the response to it was really strong. In particular, the response to the two lead actors was really strong. Julia Roberts and Albert Finney both got terrific notices for the film. There was a little bit of pushback on the movie itself, perhaps a little bit simplistic, a little bit too Hollywood, argued one or two people. Something like a bit akin to a fairy tale, really. But also, I think most people saw that Erin Brockovich, the film, really had teeth in it as well. And for Roberts, off the back of the twin box office successes she'd enjoyed with romantic comedies the year before, here she was being praised really for a big Hollywood dramatic role. And there were early conversations a year ahead of the Academy Awards that this might be in Oscar contention as well. The film was released in cinemas then, March the 17th and 19th, 2000, and audiences turned up in droves to see it. That a $28.1 million opening weekend was a result and a half for Universal. Absolutely thrilled with that as well. It knocked the very troubled Brian De Palma movie Mission to Mars into second place. That was on its second week of release. The other big opener the same weekend as Erin Brockovich was the first Final Destination film as well. And other movies that were around at this time, My Dog Skip was in fourth place, The Ninth Gate was in fifth, The Whole Nine Yards was in sixth, American Beauty had been in cinemas for half a year at this point. Off the back of its Oscar win, it was in the top 10. The Cider House Rules was back in the top 10 as well. And the chart was rounded off by Snow Day and The Tigger Movie. Erin Brockovich would hold the top spot the second week as well, despite stiff competition from Romeo Must Die. The pair, 18.5 million and 18 million respectively, on that particular weekend. Other openers that second week were Here on Earth and Whatever It Takes, but the word of mouth on Erin Brockovich was serving it really well, that its weekend-on-weekend drops were relatively low. It would hold the top spot for a third week going into April of 2000, again holding off three new openers this time, The Road to El Dorado, The Skulls and High Fidelity. And in the end, it was the movie Rules of Engagement, Cuba Gooding Jr. and Robert De Niro, if memory serves, that knocked it off the top spot. But still, Erin Brockovich hung around the chart for a long time, and Universal was not really dropping it wasn't in a rush to drop the cinema count either. Its US take in the end, after over half a year on release, was $125 million. It then added another $130 million outside of the US, and this is an R-rated drama really as well. And so this was the kind of number that was at the top end of expectations for the movie. Meanwhile, Steven Soderbergh was rounding off the film Traffic. And come the following year's Oscars, well, he would find himself in contention for two different films. That Erin Brockovich found itself nominated for 5 Academy Awards for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actor and Best Screenplay for Susanna Grant as well. But the Oscars that particular year also saw Steven Soderbergh competing with Steven Soderbergh for the film Traffic, which also was nominated for lots of the big awards. It would be Julia Roberts who would take home her first and at this point only Academy Award for taking on the title role in the film. She would win, seeing off competition from the likes of Joan Allen in The Contender, Juliette Binoche in Chocolat. Ellen Burstyn was up that year for Requiem for a Dream, and the brilliant Laura Linney for You Can Count on Me. Soderbergh did win Best Director. He had a 2 in 5 chance, but he won it for Traffic, and the Best Picture that year went to Gladiator. In terms of the aftermath of the film, I mean, it's interesting to go back to the interview that Erin Brockovich herself did with The Independent in the aftermath of the film's release. I mean, several years afterwards, really. And The Independent noted that she paid a price, really, for her fame and fortune, that her story was now very high profile, and the fact that she'd been remunerated for it was high profile as well. So people came to her ask after her money, really. And The Independent noted she'd seen two of her children go through problems, that she'd had two ex-partners try to extort her, and Ed Masry had passed. The real life Ed Masry had passed in 2006 as well, and so The Independent caught her at quite a difficult time in her life. But she reflected that the film was 98% accurate, and she was happy with that. In the case of PG&E, a spokesman for that company said the movie is an entertainment vehicle, certainly not a documentary. And Time magazine, around the time of the film's release, also noted dissatisfaction from a bunch of residents in the Hinckley area at being portrayed as, quote, a bunch of hicks as well. And so there were little bits of pushback and there were little bits of dissatisfaction with it. But still, at the end of it all, there was a hugely successful movie. And if Erin Brockovich had gone into this hoping that the profile of the story would be significantly raised and that the name of the antagonist company in the story would be on people's lips, well, I think we could safely say that was mission accomplished. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from me on Blue Sky as well, actually, at Simon Brew. I'm trying to work out how to use that. Film Stories is on both of those, at Film Stories, on facebook.com/Film Stories Online, youtube.com/Film Stories. The Patreon is patreon.com/Simon Brew. The website, we do a clickbait-free entertainment website. We talk movies, TV, games on that site. And in a world where you have to write clickbait and articles telling you everything you need to know about this and then take 700 words to get to the point, we're trying to do something different and we really need your support with that. Thank you to everyone who's continuing to support what we're doing at www.filmstories.co.uk, and our online shop, which has all of our print magazines, at least the ones that aren't sold out, and our UK exclusive Blu-ray releases of Bull Durham and No Way Out. You can find that at store.filmstories.co.uk. But as always, I've waffled on far too much, so I'm going to go off and watch another bunch of films now. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time. Take care. Look after yourselves. Bye-bye.